So in conclusion to the course, this lecture gives an overview of the main points that have been made. The central theme has been that understanding of a complex system always involves creation of a hierarchy of descriptions. At the highest level of such a hierarchy, it's possible to create a description of a complete process for performing a feature from end to end in such a way that the information content of the description doesn't exceed the capabilities of the human mind. But the limit on information content means that the description at this high level is approximate. However, the hierarchy of description capability means that if a larger degree of accuracy is needed, any small piece of the highest level description can be mapped to a more detailed level, with the information content of any one piece staying within the information handling capabilities of the brain, even at this more detailed level. For even more accuracy, an even smaller piece of any one small piece can be mapped to a yet more detailed level, still within brain information handling capabilities for each of the even smaller pieces. Unless such a hierarchy of descriptions can be created, a complex system could be modeled using a computer, but intuitively satisfying understanding will not be possible. And we saw that this applies to electronic systems, and it also applies in the hard physical sciences. The course has followed a series of steps to establish an effective hierarchy of descriptions for the brain. First, we looked at how hierarchies of description work for a number of different examples, like television, computers, complex electronic systems, and in the physical sciences, and we identified the properties such a hierarchy of descriptions has to have in order to be effective. Then, we described a number of the major phenomena of higher cognition, like the memory for facts, the memory for events, the memory for skills, the limits on how many things we can think about at the same time that we call working memory, and also speech capabilities, and even human consciousness and self-awareness. Then we put the cognitive phenomena aside for a time and plunged into a description of some of the major aspects of the physical brain. The major anatomical structures like the cortex, the thalamus, the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and so on. The substructures of those major structures like areas and columns in the cortex, subnuclei in the thalamus, different nuclei in the basal ganglia, CA fields and other substructures of the hippocampus, and so forth. And a major theme was how all of these structures and substructures are connected together. We also talked about the properties of neurons and neuron substructures like dendrites and synapses. And we also looked at some selected chemical processes within and between neurons, especially the critical processes that manage changes to synaptic weights. Having then discussed both the cognitive phenomena and the physical brain that implements all these phenomena, we went next in a somewhat different direction to look at some theoretical system architecture considerations. In particular, we identified a number of practical needs, like the need to limit the amount of physical information processing resources that a system uses to perform all its behaviors, and the need to acquire new behaviors without interference with how previous behaviors were performed. And we saw that these types of needs strongly constrain the architectural form of any system that must perform a wide range of different behaviors. In the case of electronic systems, where all the behaviors are designed under external intellectual control, we saw that the needs result in the physical architecture having the familiar separation between memory and processing. In contrast, for a system that defines most of its behaviors heuristically from experience, the physical architecture will tend to have a major separation between a subsystem that defines and detects conditions and a subsystem that associates condition detections with behaviors. And we identified a whole range of more detailed architectural constraints we could expect to see in a learning system. And given that natural selection will tend to favor brain architectures that best satisfy all the practical needs, these were effectively predictions of what we should expect to see in brain anatomy. We then went back to the brain anatomy and physiology, and we compared the material covered earlier with the theoretical predictions. In these comparisons, we found that actual anatomy and physiology indeed match what we would expect to see in a brain subject to the architectural constraints. And a major consequence was that it became possible to identify the types of information processes being performed by different anatomical structures, with a key implication being that these information processes make it possible to create the hierarchies of description that we need for intuitively satisfying understanding. From there, we showed how to create the hierarchies of description we need to understand general phenomena like semantic or episodic memory, but also to understand how very specific individual cognitive tasks are performed, like imagining a party in a location and with people we've never seen, or identifying a familiar object in a photograph taken from an unusual angle, all in terms of anatomy and physiology. Remember, these were the practical considerations: the needs to limit physical resources, to learn without interference with earlier learning, to handle a continuous stream of sensory inputs without confusing one input with another, the need to develop brains from DNA blueprints without too many errors, and the need to allow learning on very long timescales that we call evolution. The practical needs often conflict with each other, and the system architecture for a complex learning system is forced into a compromise that can adequately satisfy all the needs. At the highest level, this architecture is forced into the major separation between the two subsystems. And recall that this separation is analogous with, but of course qualitatively different from, the separation between memory and processing in an electronic system that's designed under external intellectual control. In both cases, practical needs place constraints on the architecture, but the corresponding needs take the system architectures in different directions. A corollary of the high-level separation is that there are two general types of information processes performed by a complex learning system: condition, definition, and detection, where any actual process, definition and detection are entangled, and behavioral recommendation, weight, assignment, and use, where again assignment and use are entangled. And once more, this is analogous with, but qualitatively different from, the instruction and the data read-write processes in electronic systems. But in both types of system, it's the existence of these information process models permeating the system from top to bottom that makes it possible to create hierarchies of description. At high levels, cognitive tasks can be described in terms of very general condition and recommendation processes. At more detailed levels, the high-level condition and recommendation processes can be broken down into more detailed condition and recommendation processes. And the ability to use the same types of process models at different levels of description makes mapping between the levels feasible. The conditions defined and detected in a complex learning system, and the groups of conditions we call receptive fields, don't correspond with cognitive categories or cognitive features. And as an example, the receptive fields detected by columns in the cortical area TE are critical for identifying different categories of visual objects, but don't individually correspond with object categories. If this represents the cortical columns in this object discrimination area, there could be many columns, illustrated in red, that sometimes detect their receptive fields in response to, for example, seeing different birds. All those red receptive fields will have some recommendation strength in favor of bird-appropriate behaviors. But of course, only a small subset will be detected in response to any one bird experience. If we illustrate the same area a second time, some columns in that same area also detect their receptive fields in response to seeing cats, although again, only a small subset will be detected in response to any one cat experience. Some columns could detect their receptive fields in response to some birds and also some cats, because there could be some visual similarities. Both have heads, legs, and so on. These receptive fields will have recommendation strengths in favor of both bird and cat appropriate behaviors. But illustrating the same area for a third time, and showing the columns detecting their receptive fields in response to one particular instance of cat, some columns with bird-appropriate recommendation strengths could be detecting their receptive fields, like the one indicated. But the predominant recommendation strength must be in favor of cat-appropriate behaviors, like saying, "That's a cat." So the key requirement is that all the different receptive fields in the area must be able to discriminate between different types of objects. And discriminate means that the groups of columns detected within different instances of cats are sufficiently similar to each other and sufficiently different from the groups detected in response to any other type of object that it's possible to assign recommendation strengths in a way that results in high-integrity behavior selections. In the process of evolution, different areas in the cortex have been specified genetically. And they've been specified in such a way that heuristically defined columns in each area are able to discriminate between different types of circumstances. And across all the columns in all the areas, it's generally possible to discriminate between any two situations for which the appropriate behavioral response is different. It's sometimes useful to put approximate labels on the types of cognitive situations that are best discriminated by an area, as I've illustrated in the diagram. And we made a lot of use of this rather more approximate model, with areas able to discriminate between objects, between groups of objects, and so on. But this type of model, although very useful for high-level understanding, is, of course, approximate. And we did, for example, consider this rather more complex model when the simpler model was too approximate, was inadequate. At this more detailed level, several areas could contribute significant recommendation strengths useful for identifying categories, for example. But even more areas could occasionally be useful. For example, a straight edge in the visual field might be indicated by detection of receptive fields in the relatively simple area indicated. But such detections at this simple level could sometimes be useful for discriminating between different types of object, such as an artificial object, which is more likely to have a straight edge than a natural object like an animal. And more complex receptive fields, at what we might label group of objects or group of groups levels, could also sometimes have valuable recommendation strengths in favor of appropriate object-related behaviors. If one type of group of objects often contains one specific object, detections of the receptive fields corresponding with the group on the basis of the other objects might provide useful extra object-level recommendation strength in favor of a less visible object. For example, if David, Mark, and Ted have often been seen together, and if we can't clearly see the third person in some group with David and Mark, it's probably Ted. A key factor in higher cognition is that receptive fields can be detected not just because they're present in current sensory inputs, but also because they've been active in the past in a way that correlates with the activity of receptive fields that are currently being detected. They've often been active in the past at the same time as some currently active fields, for example. And indirectly activated receptive fields can themselves recommend indirect activation of other receptive fields, leading to long chains of indirect activation that can access recommendation strengths completely absent from the receptive fields detected within current sensory inputs. On many different levels, the information processes performed by anatomical structures and the connectivity between them can be understood. At this highest level, the information roles of major anatomical structures and major connectivity paths between them are identified. At this highest level, the cortex defines and detects receptive fields. The basal ganglia interprets receptive field detections as behavioral recommendations and implements the behaviors with the largest total weights across all current receptive field detections. The thalamus implements behaviors by releasing detections into, between, or out of cortical areas. The basal forebrain ensures that releases only occur when the time is exactly right. The hippocampus manages changes to cortical receptive fields, and the amygdala, supported by the hypothalamus, places priorities on different types of behaviors. Finally, if a sequence of behaviors is often used in the same order, the cerebellum records the sequence and implements it rapidly and accurately when needed. At a somewhat more detailed level, different cortical areas define and detect receptive fields on different levels of complexity, as we discussed a few moments ago. In some cases, an area defines receptive fields that record temporally correlated activity by groups of columns in other areas. These types of receptive field support functions like semantic, episodic, and working memory and priming. At an even more detailed level in the cortex, the information role of a cortical column includes generating receptive field detections that can recommend behaviors, or that can be incorporated in detections of more complex receptive fields in other columns. But also, critically, a column also signals its internal activity, and that signal can be used to manage receptive field expansions. Similarly, in the basal ganglia, the information roles of different nuclei and connectivity paths can be identified, all contributing to the overall behavior selection role. The spiral of connectivity from the striatum to the midbrain dopamines and back to somewhat more dorsal regions of the striatum can be understood in terms of the management of strategic, tactical, and detailed rewards. The internal paths through the thalamus can be understood as coming together to make appropriate releases of cortical information. And recall that at an even more detailed level, these information releases are supported by a frequency modulation mechanism that bunches action potential spikes together in time, including the 40 Hz gamma band modulation that's the primary release mechanism, and the 8 Hz theta band that modulates the gamma band when release can only occur when some other brain process has concluded. And the reason this frequency modulation works is that an action potential spike arriving at an excitatory synapse causes a rapid rise in the injected postsynaptic potential, reaching a peak in about 2 milliseconds, then decaying with a time constant of about 8 milliseconds. So unless two spikes arrive within 8 milliseconds of each other, the effect of the first spike is gone before the second arrives. So a bunch of spikes must arrive within less than 8 milliseconds of each other if they're going to reinforce each other and trigger an output from a target neuron. In the hippocampal system, the different nuclei, regions, and connectivity paths can be understood as supporting different information aspects of cortical change management. The connectivity of the amygdala and hypothalamus support behavioral prioritizations that we label emotions. And the nuclei and connectivity of the cerebellar system support different aspects of managing frequently used sequences of behaviors. So all these structures get cortical outputs, interpret them behaviorally, and in most cases return the conclusions to the cortex. So we can view cognition as sequences of cortical processes. We can label what the subcortical structures are doing, but we generally can understand how the cortical processes support cognition without getting into the details of the processes within the subcortical structures. Most of the time, it's a good enough approximation to leave out how those subcortical structures are performing their functions. In other words, to establish a high-level understanding of how we perform some cognitive task, we can describe the task as a succession of patterns of activity across the cortex, sometimes sensory inputs, often indirect activations recommended by previous activity pattern. The pattern evolves until there's some predominant recommendation strength in favor of a behavior that completes the task. Let me give you a couple of examples, not just general cognitive phenomena, but specific cognitive tasks. Firstly, a prospective memory task. Remember, prospective memory is the ability to make plans and remember them when needed. For this purpose, we'll use this illustrated cortical model, receptive fields detected at different levels of complexity within sensory inputs. We'll use the fact that columns can indirectly activate other columns on the basis of past temporal correlations, but we'll leave out explicit reference to all the cortical areas with the receptive fields that make these indirect activations possible. Now, as an example, let's think about making and going to a doctor's appointment. And suppose you're on the phone with a doctor's office and agree to an appointment next Thursday at 11 a.m. So when making the appointment, hearing the word doctor directly activates auditory columns, which in turn indirectly activate visual columns on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity, pseudo-visual images of doctors offices perhaps. The words Thursday and 11 a.m. directly activate multiple populations of auditory columns at different levels of complexity, and the auditory columns, again, indirectly activate visual columns on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity. Sensory input derived from the physical symptoms result in proprioceptive receptive field detections, and these drive indirect activations in the auditory areas on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity, perhaps as a result of describing symptoms in the past. All of the active receptive fields can be synchronized in various ways to drive more complex receptive field detections in other areas. I've indicated these more complex receptive fields in purple. Now, because the juxtaposition of doctor, symptoms, and Thursday morning is novel, there's going to be receptive field expansions, which I've indicated by the shading darker at the bottom. All this activity is then extinguished. But a couple of days later, the name of the day is perhaps heard first thing in the morning, leading to detection of receptive fields. Perhaps the symptoms are noticed, leading to other receptive field detections. Combination receptive fields are detected, and perhaps receptive fields on the basis of frequent past simultaneous activity. Now, there was a recent receptive field expansion episode when the appointment was made, and this population that's now active includes some of the columns active at that time. So there's recommendation strength in favor of indirect activation on the basis of recent receptive field expansion. More columns are activated, and those that were active when the appointment was made. And that leads to a population with significant overlap with the earlier population. So this final population may have significant recommendation strength into the basal ganglia in favor of going to the doctor. Now, as my second example, let me describe a much simpler cognitive task. This task is solving the type of puzzle you sometimes see in a newspaper. What are the differences between these two pictures? The cortical model I'll use will include an area with visual receptive fields at a complexity able to discriminate between different groups of objects, and also an area which can discriminate between situations in which two separate populations in the visual area have a lot of overlap, lots of the same columns active in both populations, and situations where there's less overlap between the two populations in that visual area. In solving the task, the gaze moves back and forth between the two pictures, fixating on corresponding positions in the two pictures. So suppose the gaze fixates on that region indicated in green, the face of the worker. Receptive fields are detected within the discriminates groups of objects area. Recall that this involves frequency modulation of the outputs of the primary visual area to drive more complex receptive field detections in that higher visual area. activity of those receptor fields is prolonged. And remember, that involves creation of short-term receptor fields elsewhere. Then the gaze shifts to the corresponding region in the other picture. Receptive fields are detected within the new visual inputs. And the picture in the two regions is the same. So the population of receptive field detections will also be pretty much the same. The next step is release of outputs from those two populations in the visual area to the comparison area, which drives receptive field detections in that comparison area. These receptive fields are different from the ones that would be detected if the images were different in the attention region. So these receptive fields can recommend behaviors appropriate for detecting no difference. Next, attention is focused on a different part of the image. Receptive field detections are obtained in response to the sensory inputs, which are again prolonged. Attention shifts to the corresponding region in the second picture, once more driving receptive field detections. The two populations of detections are released to the comparison area, driving receptive field detections in that area. Now, in the visual area, there's rather less overlap between the two populations of visual receptive fields. So, the receptive fields in the comparison area are different from the ones that were detected when the two regions were identical. So the latest receptive field detections in that comparison area are appropriate for recommending behaviors appropriate in response to detecting a difference. Now note that these tasks require a sequence of steps: attention behaviors, prolongation behaviors, release behaviors, and finally speech and muscle movements in exactly the right order. Such sequences of steps could have been coded in the cerebellum as a result of similar tasks in the past and invoked in this situation. So what we've seen is that any cognitive behavior can be described as sequences of detailed steps. Each step is an information process in some major brain structure or between two major brain structures. And we use an information architecture which gives the types of information process performed by each major structure. So we can map a psychological level description into a more detailed description in terms of major anatomical structures. We can take a small part of a task and map it into information processes in one anatomical structure, say the cortex, for example. And to do that, we use an information model for the cortex with different roles for different areas. So that means we can map to a more detailed and more precise level of description. We can take a small part of that description and map to an even more detailed description in terms of cortical columns. And to do that, we use the information model for a column. So we have an even more precise description for an even smaller part of the process. Cortical columns are made of neurons, most of them pyramidal neurons, and we can create an even more detailed description of different parts of the column level description. And again, we make use of the information model for neurons, with apical and basal dendrites detecting different types of receptive fields. So again, we can map to more detailed levels. A key component of a neuron is a dendritic branch. And the information model for dendritic branches allows mapping to an even more detailed level. Beyond dendritic branches, there are synapses, and beyond that, the molecules embedded in synaptic walls that can trigger cascades of chemical reactions. So a small part of the dendritic branch level description can be mapped to a synaptic level, and a small part of that to a chemical level, using the information model with cascades of interacting kinase reactions recommending expression of DNA to implement different structural changes to the synapses. In other words, we can take any cognitive task, even very specific tasks, and describe how that task is performed in terms of more detailed anatomical and physiological processes through a hierarchy of descriptions that can extend down to neurochemistry. And it's made possible by the existence of common information models, condition and recommendation processes that exist on all levels of the brain. And the models exist because of practical considerations enforced by natural selection pressures. So in conclusion, it is straightforward to understand higher cognition in terms of brain anatomy, physiology, and chemistry.